When a newborn's hair color makes you ponder the mysteries of life. Should I see it as a warning, or is the light in the nursery just playing with my eyes? Turns out, the little bundle of joy I thought was mine came with a paternity test that had a plot twist worthy of a bestseller. So, I decided to part ways with my wife and, well, let's just say she ended up with a lot less than she started with. Life really knows how to throw a curveball, doesn't it? I decided to take a paternity test when my newborn's hair color raised a few eyebrows, mine, to be exact. I took it upon myself to ensure that my wife didn't get her way this time around. I'm a 26-year-old guy, and my wife Rachel is 25. We've been happily married for just 2 years now. Well, we like to think of ourselves as a pretty young couple. Thus far, our journey as a couple has been smooth and uneventful, leading me to believe that we were headed in the right direction. We just welcomed a little one into the world recently. When I discovered we were having a little dude, I was over the moon. My dad was a real piece of work, and I took notes on exactly how not to step into those fatherly shoes. I was all set to be the ultimate dad for this little one, ready to tackle the challenges with a grin and maybe a dad joke or two. As soon as he appeared, my doubts kicked in like an overzealous alarm clock, and let me tell you, it really put a damper on what was supposed to be a flawless day for yours truly. To set the stage, let me give you a little background on my wife's family and mine. Picture the whitest ghost you can imagine, then add a shock of bright red hair. That's me, the palest ginger you've ever laid eyes on. I'm talking about the kind of ginger that turns into a lobster even when the sun is playing hide and seek behind the clouds. So, my wife is this stunning blonde with sparkling blue eyes, and then our little bundle of joy arrives sporting a head full of black hair and deep brown eyes. Guess we've got a little mystery on our hands. The moment I laid eyes on him, a little voice of doubt crept in, but the sheer joy of the occasion squashed it like a bug under a boot. Yet, as the days rolled on, those pesky questions kept poking at me from the shadows of my thoughts. My son was the spitting image of someone else entirely, definitely not me. I get it, most newborns resemble little angry potatoes, but I could definitely spot a few traits that reminded me of his mom. He sported those adorable dimples, and it seemed they shared a nose that could practically be a family heirloom. I couldn't spot even the tiniest hint of myself in that reflection, but the hair? Now that was a whole different story. It was like a wild animal had taken up residence on my head. Now, I'm no biologist, and I get that hair color genetics can be as clear as mud, but honestly, I just couldn't wrap my head around how my son ended up with black hair. I distinctly recall reaching out to a doctor buddy, just to make sure I wasn't overlooking anything important. In my family, we've got a handful of redheads sprinkled in, but the majority of us are rocking the classic brown hair look. In my family, the only black hair comes courtesy of some in-laws and their little ones. Meanwhile, my wife's clan is practically a blonde convention, with a sprinkle of dirty thrown in for good measure, and her dad? Well, he's got brown hair, just to keep things interesting. I used to quip that they resembled a band of Vikings ready to raid the nearest village. No matter how deep I dove into the sea of research, I just couldn't wrap my head around the mystery of my son's black hair. It was like trying to solve a riddle that had no answer, and I was left scratching my head in confusion. Well, I always knew genetics could throw a curveball or two, but the idea that some long-lost black-haired ancestor might just pop up in my DNA was a bit much. So, instead of waiting for the family reunion of the century, I figured it was time to take the bull by the horns and get a paternity test. It was like a slap in the face from an old friend, but hey, what could I do? Choices were as scarce as a unicorn at a dog park. The suspense was driving me up the wall, and I could see it was beginning to rub off on my wife as well. She picked up on my less than joyful vibes, and there were moments when I looked like I'd rather wrestle a porcupine than carry or play with our son. I managed to talk myself into believing that a paternity test was the golden ticket for everyone involved. If I were mistaken, my brain would finally take a chill pill, and we could all just waltz back to the good old days of normalcy. I'd just lug around a sprinkle of guilt for a bit, but as long as she remained blissfully unaware, I'd manage to shake it off like a pesky fly. And if I turned out to be right and my son wasn't actually my son, well, I'd just roll with the punches when that bombshell dropped. I decided to take the plunge and get myself a home paternity test. Because, nothing says family bonding quite like a little DIY DNA drama. I found myself on a little adventure to the pharmacy to grab one of those things myself. I figured ordering it online was a bit like playing hide and seek with my wife, only I'd be the one hiding and she'd be the seeker, and trust me, she's got a knack for finding things before I do. The pharmacy tests are quite affordable and almost always hit the mark with their accuracy. Sure, they can make their grand debut in court, but let's not jump the gun here. First things first, I had to figure out if the kiddo was really my little mini-me. Snagging a moment alone with him to run the test was a piece of cake. I just signed up to keep an eye on him while Rachel caught some Z's. She was absolutely thrilled to go along with that. If you've ever had the delightful experience of caring for a newborn, then you know I'm not just spinning a yarn when I say she was out like a light in under 5 minutes. As soon as she drifted off into dreamland, I quietly pulled out the test kit and set to work with the swabs, gathering DNA like a detective on a quirky case. I bundled everything up with the precision of a seasoned packer and secured the baby snugly in the carrier, ready for our next adventure. So, I made a quick getaway to drop off the package in the mail. I had this nagging worry that Rachel might wake up before I made it back home, and I was all set to spin a tale about going for a walk. Thankfully, she was still in the land of dreams, blissfully unaware of my little escapade. The suspense of waiting for the results was like watching paint dry, if the paint were made of pure anxiety. I put in a solid effort to keep my heart from getting all mushy over the little one. In my mind, I always called him anything but my son, just to cushion the fall in case the results turned out to be as grim as I dreaded. All the while, Rachel fretted over my growing tendency to drift off into my own little world. She was even fretting that I might be in a bit of a funk. I spun a little tale and claimed I was wiped out from work in the new baby. Because who wouldn't buy that story, right? She appeared to take that as a perfectly reasonable explanation. I felt a twinge of guilt for spinning a little yarn, but hey, the truth was still on the back burner for now. Women aren't exactly rolling out the welcome mat for the notion of paternity tests. After a week of refreshing my inbox like a caffeine-fueled squirrel, the email finally arrived. I found myself barricaded in the bathroom, book in hand, staring at it like it was a dragon guarding a treasure. It took me ages to muster the courage to crack it open. Definitely not the guy who contributed the DNA. It was as if a heavyweight champion had decided my gut was the perfect target for a surprise roundhouse. Ouch. For a brief second, I attempted to persuade myself that this had to be some sort of mix-up. Perhaps I had a little too much fun with the sample and turned it into a science experiment gone wrong. Well, it's entirely possible I might have gone about it the wrong way. Well, I'm no medical professional or anything of the sort, you know? The classic art of excuse-making. I was a master at it, no doubt. I had taken every precaution imaginable, and let me tell you, I pride myself on being the cautious type. Until about a year back, I was the proud architect of model plane kits, turning tiny plastic pieces into airborne dreams. I could totally follow directions, like a well-trained puppy on a leash, except, you know, without the tail wagging and the occasional squirrel distraction. Oh, trust me, I assure you, the blunder wasn't on my part. Well, I suppose I had that inkling from the get-go, didn't I? The uncertainty that had been nagging at me since the first time I laid eyes on him had suddenly morphed into something tangible. It was downright nauseating because deep down, I was really hoping this was all a big mistake. I had this wild idea that he could be my kid. I had a mind to bring him up right. I had already fallen head over heels for that tiny bundle of joy, but alas, he wasn't my little one, and I just couldn't put myself through that emotional roller coaster. That one took me a hot minute to bounce back from. I found myself perched on the bathroom throne for a solid half hour, contemplating life's mysteries, before Rachel decided it was time to check on my well-being. She gave a polite rap on the door and inquired if I was holding up all right. I assured her that I definitely wasn't. I swung the door wide and presented her with the test results, like a magician revealing the grand finale of a trick, except there were no rabbits, just numbers and a lot of suspense. All I mentioned was, "He doesn't belong to me." She turned as white as a ghost and just stood there, frozen in silence for what felt like an eternity. Once she pulled herself together, she caught me off guard by asking how I could even entertain the idea of a paternity test. She launched into a passionate tirade about trust and all the trials she faced while carrying the baby, but I couldn't help but snap back at her. I kindly suggested she take a moment of silence. She blinked at me as if I had just delivered a surprise slap to her face. I had never chatted with her in that way before, but I wasn't about to just stand there and let her twist my feelings into a pretzel for being duped. I warned her, "Don't push your luck with my patience." From the first glance, I had a hunch about him, and I figured it was time to dig a little deeper and uncover the truth. Her eyes glistened as if they were gearing up for a dramatic tearjerker moment. I was half expecting her to spill the beans, but instead, she just shrugged and said it was likely a mix-up. Classic, right? I told her to cut the nonsense and just spill the beans for once, no more fibs. After a moment of silence that could rival a suspenseful novel, she strolled into the living room and plopped down into a chair like it was the most exhausting marathon of her life. She buried her face in her hands, letting out a few sobs, and then looked up with a pleading expression, saying, "Please, don't hate me." My heart took a nosedive. Well, would you look at that, it turns out it was true after all. Why not give her a break? The ship had sailed on that one. All the joy I had basked in after the birth vanished like a magician's rabbit, thanks to her. After a minute of heartfelt sobbing, she finally managed to carry on. She insisted it was just a one-off, a little hiccup that would never see the light of day again. She mentioned that she had won too many drinks at her friend's bachelorette party and, before she knew it, found herself waking up next to a guy she definitely didn't plan on sharing a pillow with. She mentioned that she didn't even catch his name. I was caught in a whirlwind of doubt, unsure if I should take her word for gospel or just chalk it up to another tall tale. Just a little mishap that resulted in her expecting a baby? So, she had no clue who the biological dad was, huh? Well, that sure has a whiff of convenience about it, doesn't it? But then it hit me, it really didn't make a difference at all. The harm was already in the rearview mirror, and boy, it was a sight to behold. She thought she could pull a fast one and convince me that another guy's kid was mine. I couldn't have cared less about his identity. Well, that was her little pickle. My dilemma was figuring out how to extricate Rachel from my existence. Rachel was still wailing like a banshee, and let me tell you, it was testing my patience like a toddler in a candy store. Why was she crying like she was the one in pain here? Well, at least she still had a son to keep her company in this wild ride called life. It was as if I'd misplaced a kid I never even got around to having in the first place. I adored him to bits, and now I was faced with the reality that I couldn't be the one to help him grow up. Well, let me tell you, he definitely didn't come from my gene pool. I had no intention of dedicating my life to raising someone else's little bundle of joy. I turned to Rachel and asked if she had any clue about the chaos she had unleashed in my life. I told her it wasn't just a little betrayal, she had taken a sledgehammer to my heart and left the pieces scattered everywhere. I inquired how she could possibly pull this stunt on me. How on earth could she think it was okay to pretend someone else's kid was mine? She paused her dramatic sobbing just long enough to string together a sentence that made sense. She admitted her mistake with a sigh, and let me tell you, the look on her face when she discovered she was pregnant was something straight out of a comedy, terrified and bewildered, like a deer caught in headlights. She mentioned she had been holding on to the hope that he was my little one, thinking the stars had finally aligned for me to step into the role of dad. She insisted that she had shed tears and sent up prayers daily, hoping against hope that the little one belonged to me. She went on and on about prayer, hopes, and dreams, and I found my mind wandering to more interesting topics, like what I was going to have for lunch. What was the whole deal, anyway? Whatever she said, it wasn't going to budge the truth an inch. I just popped the question to her, had she ever thought about spilling the beans to me? She paused for a beat, casting her gaze elsewhere as if the floor suddenly had something fascinating to offer. Well, naturally, that was a no-brainer. If he had sported a resemblance to my charming self, or if I had chosen to ignore my gut feelings, I'd still be blissfully unaware of the truth. If I had only been a tad more trusting, she would have happily continued her little charade. And I would just keep spinning that web of deception. I could have easily raised that kid as if he were my own, while she stood by me, fully aware that the little guy was supposedly the offspring of some random dude she barely knew. Talk about a plot twist, right? Well, that was a real doozy. I mentioned to her that I could really use a little breathing room. In a whirlwind of activity, I threw together a bag and was out the door in less time than it takes to brew a cup of coffee. I spilled the whole story to my brother, and he just shrugged and let it all pile up at his place like it was the latest episode of a sitcom. I didn't just step out of the house to escape Rachel, you know. There was a whole world out there calling my name, well, at least the coffee shop was. As cold as it may seem, I found myself needing a little break from the baby as well. Every time I pictured that grin of his or saw him dozing off in my embrace, it was like a little jab to the heart, like my chest was trying to remind me that feelings can be a bit of a roller coaster ride. Try as I might, I somehow ended up forming a bond with him anyway. Well, of course it was. Who wouldn't expect that? Here I was, on the brink of losing him, and let me tell you, the agony was like trying to swallow a cactus. And who do I have to thank for this delightful predicament? Rachel, of course. For the next few days, I crashed at my brother's place. I skillfully dodged Rachel's calls like a pro, even though she seemed to have taken up a new hobby of ringing me non-stop. Her voice was the last thing I wanted to hear, like a cat serenading a dog at midnight. Honestly, I was just as eager to avoid the sound of that little one's wails. I had to put up some walls to give myself a fighting chance to recover from her antics. Well, That was my ticket to moving on and tackling the next big thing on my to-do list. Well, let me tell you, it's been quite the journey. Being away from him stings a bit, but hey, reminding myself that I'm not his dad does take the edge off, doesn't it? I've decided to grant myself one more week to gather my thoughts, and then it's time to dive into the delightful task of filing for divorce. You aim to be the ultimate dad, but here you are, tangled up in a web of questions about your family and your marriage, wondering if you accidentally signed up for a reality show instead of a family life. Handling that paternity test was likely the only route to some peace of mind, even if it felt like you were stepping on a Lego barefoot. To be frank, your wife's explanation came off as a bit of a scramble to fix things, and honestly, it felt like a recipe for chaos. So, she made a little oopsie, and now there's a kid in the picture whose dad is basically a mystery? Talk about a plot twist. Well, that's a bit of a facepalm moment, isn't it? Here's the latest scoop. Well. It seems like ages since I last checked in, and I figured it was high time to share how the saga of my life is unfolding. My original post really caught a lot of attention, like a cat in a room full of laser pointers. Well, let me tell you, the first thing that jumps out is that it didn't exactly become a walk in the park. Someone tossed out the idea that I should quit seeing him as my little bundle of joy and start viewing him as her little munchkin instead. At first, it felt like trying to run a marathon in flip-flops, but I've got to hand it to that experience, it turned out to be a real game changer in the end. It allowed for a clearer view of the situation, like putting on a fresh pair of glasses after a long day of squinting at the fine print. Rachel had no intention of rolling out the red carpet for me, that's for sure. She was like a persistent telemarketer, bombarding me with phone calls and text messages, trying to get my attention. Her texts had a certain air of urgency, like a cat stuck in a tree, frantically meowing for help. She was practically begging me to return home and lend a hand with the little one. She claimed she was indifferent to what the DNA results had to say. In her eyes, I was the dad of the century. I was the guy who had looked after him and helped him grow, like a gardener tending to a particularly stubborn plant. I was the genius behind his name choice. Well, that officially crowned me as the dad, regardless of what the scientists might have to say about it. That really ticked me off. She was really trying to give me a lesson on responsibility, all while she was busy pulling off a paternity fraud stunt. Talk about irony. I finally saw her performance for what it truly was. She had no intention of becoming a single mom, thank you very much. She was completely in the dark about who the father might be. Or maybe he was just a drifter, the kind who couldn't lend a hand even if he had a map and a GPS. Well, she was really out of luck because I had no intention of stepping into the role of substitute dad. 2 weeks after packing my bags and heading for the door, I decided it was time to file for divorce. I would have jumped on it earlier, but I was so rattled by her antics that I had to hit the pause button and let my brain catch up with my emotions. Meanwhile, I had a lawyer on standby, ready to tackle the whole shebang for me. Child support was definitely high on my list of worries. Child support laws can be a real circus, can't they? I was genuinely concerned she might try to rope me into paying for a kid who wasn't even mine. He said it was definitely doable, but only if I had been playing the role of the child's dad in a legal sense. Who knew parenting came with so many fine print clauses? There was just one little thing I hadn't gotten around to, signing the birth certificate. When those pesky doubts crept in about whether the little one was actually mine, I thought it best to hold off on signing that birth certificate for the time being. I spun a web of excuses and somehow never quite managed to get to it. And eventually, Rachel gave up on the whole asking me about it thing. Well, it turns out I wasn't the kid's dad in any official sense, legally or biologically. But my lawyer, bless his heart, made it clear that I wasn't exactly off the hook either. He pointed out that, in the end, it was the court's call, and he'd do everything in his power to nudge them toward a reasonable conclusion. Rachel decided that texting and calling were so last season and opted for the grand entrance instead. She caught wind of my little arrangement at my brother's place and decided to pay him a visit, more than once, mind you. Talk about persistence. We always kept her on the outside looking in. We didn't even have a chat with her. She had a knack for making an exit, but that last time, she plopped herself down on the porch for 3 whole hours, cradling the baby like a prized possession. Maybe she thought that by showcasing my son, she could charm me into changing my mind. She finally decided to take her leave when my brother dialed up the cops to give her the boot. Well, she decided to play hide and seek with the house after that. Spoiler alert, the house lost. As the divorce drama unfolded, she casually tossed out the idea of mediation like it was a suggestion for dinner. "How about we just sit down and chat?" she said, as if we were deciding on pizza toppings instead of untangling a life together. She was convinced we could sort things out like two reasonable adults and figure out what was best for the little one. I gently pointed out that the little bundle of joy wasn't exactly my responsibility. She was after child support, and honestly, I'd sooner take a leisurely stroll through a field of electric fences than hand over a dime for that. Mediation? Yeah, that idea just took a high. Well, that certainly didn't put a damper on her quest for child support. Well, by that point, we found ourselves in the delightful world of court-ordered paternity tests. The results were just like before, and wouldn't you know it, that stung just as much as the first time around. Well, with a paternity test that came back as a big fat no and no birth certificate in sight, I found myself off the hook when it came to any baby duty. Talk about a plot twist. The remainder of the divorce zipped by in no time at all. Child support was the one thing that really got our feathers ruffled. Well, let's just say our treasure chest was more of a piggy bank, hardly worth a do-over. We were pet-free and living in a rented apartment, which she happily claimed as her own little kingdom. I wasn't too bothered that she got to keep it, I had already been plotting my grand escape from the city anyway. I was itching for a change of scenery, feeling like I'd exhausted all the excitement this place had to offer. It was time to shake things up a bit. Sticking around was bound to sting, but oh, how I adored that city. This woman was the catalyst for my life taking a nosedive into chaos. On top of that, the apartment was just way too spacious for my taste. We decided to make the big move when she announced she was pregnant, all in the name of creating a little more room for our future minimes. Well, here she was, about to embark on the grand adventure of solo parenting, just her and a little one to keep her company. I had a sneaky suspicion that tackling rent in the joint all by myself was a recipe for disaster. Now that she had a little one to look after, it was clear that she'd need to let that go. No more juggling flaming torches while parenting, after all. And perhaps she'd finally hunt down the father of her baby and come up with a clever scheme for some cash flow. I was pretty pleased to have come out on top in the child support showdown, but then there was the little matter of alimony lurking in the background like an unexpected plot twist. Just like a game of tug-of-war, I wrestled fiercely to keep my wallet firmly shut when it came to her demands. The thought of sending this woman money after everything she pulled made my blood boil. Well, it seems the judge has decided that my wallet will be supporting her until she decides to rejoin the workforce. Lucky me, right? But hey, at least the amount was a bright spot in all of this. I'm convinced it was that paternity test that led the judge to hand her a laughably small alimony check. I nearly erupted in laughter the moment I found out the price tag. Who knew my wallet could feel so light? But let me tell you, the true spectacle was the expression on Rachel's face. She wore a face that could make a rain cloud jealous. Everything was going sideways for her, and I couldn't help but enjoy the show. The whole mess was a disaster, but let's be honest, she was the captain who steered us right into the storm. It was quite refreshing to witness her in a bit of a tizzy for once. Rachel had a bit of a sour face when it came to the whole child support situation, like someone who just bit into a lemon and was trying to figure out how to make lemonade without any sugar. Well, it seems she decided to spread the word that I had pulled a disappearing act on her and the little one. So there I was, minding my own business, when I received a phone call that could only be described as a tornado of fury, courtesy of her mother. She looked at me with those curious eyes and asked what kind of man I was, just up and leaving a mom and her brand new baby in the lurch. Well, I must confess, I didn't step in for Rachel. I spilled the beans to her mom. Her grandson? Well, he certainly wasn't my son. He had another dad, and she was completely in the dark about it, which was just par for the course in the whirlwind of her daughter's adventurous escapades. Rachel's mom nearly fainted when she heard that. I might have gone a bit overboard, but hey, it really nailed the message, didn't it? She hung up the phone faster than a cat on a hot tin roof, and I could practically hear the steam coming out of her ears as she prepared to give Rachel a piece of her mind. I've lost touch with her, but my brother is my personal news reporter, keeping me in the loop. He claims she's having a bit of a tough time adjusting to the whole single mom gig. She has a knack for connecting with friends, whether it's to borrow a few bucks or to enlist their help in wrangling the little ones. She was having a bit of a rough time getting used to her new reality. I do my best to keep my mind off her little bundle of joy. There were still those nights when I'd find myself wide awake, pondering how differently things might have unfolded if Rachel hadn't tripped over her own shoelaces and sent the three of us tumbling down this wild rabbit hole. Most nights, I'd drift off into dreamland with a grin, feeling like I'd just sidestepped a freight train. I had this gut feeling, so I decided to take the reins of my life before I found myself knee-deep in the chaos of raising someone else's little tornado. And now Rachel finds herself navigating the wild world of single motherhood, Ready to discover just how challenging life can get when you overlook the good things right under your nose. It seems like Rachel was quite the handful, but you stood your ground like a seasoned pro and didn't let her pull you back into the chaos. That's a big win. It's pretty crazy how she pulled out all the stops, from sending texts to making a surprise appearance at your brother's house. The legal mumbo-jumbo can feel like a migraine waiting to happen, but hats off to you for having a lawyer in your corner and dodging the bullet of paying for a kid who isn't even yours. That little alimony payment feels like a tiny victory in the grand scheme of things, doesn't it? What would you have done in that situation? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, we're all ears. Thanks a bunch for hopping on board with us today in our little corner of the universe. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss our next video. It's going to be a blast. Catch you later, alligator.